Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today. Really deep.
Deeper than usual.
Oh, you bet. We're going all the way back to the beginnings of civilization.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Where are we getting our information from this time?
Well, we're going to be exploring excerpts from, let me get this right, the preface and chapter 2 of our Oriental Heritage by Will Durant.
Sounds like a fascinating read. So what are we hoping to uncover in this deep dive?
We're going right back to the basics, food, shelter, fire, all that. Trying to understand how those first societies came together and kind of paved the way for, the world we live in now.
I'm all for it, but I gotta ask, you mentioned all that. Is there something else we should be prepared for?
Well, let's just say we might encounter a few things that challenge our modern sensibilities.
Ooh, I do love a good challenge. Give me an example.
Let's just say the role of cannibalism in early human history might come up.
Cannibalism. Well, I guess you weren't kidding when you said deeper than usual. All right, I'm ready. Let's dive in.
So first things first, let's talk about how we view those early cultures, those savage or primitive societies as they're often called.
Yeah, it's interesting because those terms often carry a lot of baggage, We tend to associate them with being uncivilized or backward.
Exactly. But Durant kind of flips that on its head. He paints a picture of incredible innovation, adaptability, and even generosity that might surprise people.
Okay, now you've really got my attention. So let's start by unpacking this idea of redefining savage. Durant uses this phrase, mute wisdom of primitive improvidence. What's he getting at with that?
It's a fascinating concept. Basically, Durant is suggesting that early humans, especially those hunter-gatherers, lived very much in the present moment. They weren't stockpiling for the future or really worrying about what might come next.
So they were just living day to day, just going with the flow.
In a sense, yes. They hunted and fished when they needed to, and when they had a successful hunt, they feasted and celebrated. It was a very efficient system in a way. They took only what they needed, and there was no waste.
It does make you think about how much of our modern lives are dominated by planning and worrying about the future.
Right. Imagine a life without that constant anxiety.
Sounds kind of idyllic, but I imagine there were downsides to that approach too, right?
Absolutely. When food was scarce, their survival was on the line. This constant dance with scarcity likely pushed them to develop some incredible skills and ingenuity.
Okay, so give me an example. How did they use that ingenuity to secure food?
Well, Durant describes these Tlingit fishermen who would wear seal head caps and mimic seal sounds to attract their prey. Talk about understanding animal behavior.
Wow, that's some next-level hunting strategy. It's amazing what they could accomplish with the resources they had.
It really is, and it makes you realize that even though their societies might seem simple on the surface, there was a lot of depth and sophistication to how they lived.
So we've got these hunter-gatherers living in the moment, relying on their skills and ingenuity to survive. What was the turning point that led to the shift toward agriculture?
That's where things get really interesting. The transition to agriculture was like a massive earthquake that reshaped human history.
Okay, I'm ready for the aftershocks. Tell me everything.
It all boils down to control. As humans figured out how to domesticate animals and cultivate crops, they gained a new level of control over their food supply.
Something they didn't have as nomadic hunter-gatherers.
Exactly. And this led to greater stability, food security, and ultimately allowed for populations to grow and for those larger, more settled communities to develop.
So agriculture wasn't just about new food sources. It was about a complete transformation in how humans interacted with the world around them.
Absolutely. And with that transformation came a wave of innovation. Durant describes how tools evolved, starting from simple digging sticks, then hoes, and eventually plows, all driven by the need to become more efficient and get more out of the land.
That makes sense. But how did they go from digging sticks to plows? It's not like there was a manual or something.
Well, it seems they learned a lot by observing nature. Durant mentions the example of woodpeckers storing acorns. Perhaps that's how humans got the idea of planning ahead and, saving for the future.
That's incredible. It's like nature was their teacher, guiding them toward new innovations.
Exactly. And speaking of groundbreaking innovations, we can't forget about fire, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, where would we be without fire? Literally and figuratively.
Right. Durant really emphasizes how important it was for early humans. They used it for everything. Conquering the darkness, keeping warm, transforming metals, cooking food. You name it, fire was involved.
It's no wonder they considered it sacred, even worshipped it as a god in some cases.
Absolutely, and they would keep those fires burning constantly. Because if that fire went out, it was a major setback for the whole community.
Wow, I bet. It's interesting how even today we're still drawn to the power and symbolism of fire, bonfires, fireplaces. It's like it's in our DNA.
It really is. It's a primal instinct we inherited from those early fire-worshipping societies. But beyond the practical and symbolic, fire was also the spark that ignited industry.
How so?
Well, think about it. The ability to control and manipulate fire allowed humans to shape their environment in ways they never could before. And that control over nature is a defining characteristic of what we call civilization.
That's a really interesting point. So fire wasn't just about warmth and light. It was about unlocking human potential and driving progress.
Exactly. And that brings us to another point Durant makes that I think is really important. He challenges the assumption that primitive people were somehow technologically backward.
I'm curious to hear more about that. What kind of technological advancements did they achieve?
Oh, there were so many. They were masters of weaving intricate textiles, crafting pottery, building shelters, using only what they could find in nature. I mean, the resourcefulness and adaptability they displayed is truly mind-boggling.
Give me a specific example. What really stands out to you?
Okay, take the invention of pottery. Durant suggests they might have gotten the idea from observing how clay hardened on wickerwork baskets. It's like that aha moment where they realized, hey, we can use this.
That's amazing. It's that accidental genius we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that same ingenuity that likely played a role in the development of early trade, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, trade was a game changer. It took those relatively isolated societies and threw them into a whole new world of exchange and interaction.
Yeah. Driven by the simple fact that resources and skills weren't evenly distributed.
Right. So they had to figure out ways to get what they needed from others, first through bartering and eventually by using various mediums of exchange.
Like what? What were some of those early forms of currency?
Well, forget about credit cards and digital wallets. Back then, it was things like cattle, salt, and eventually metals.
Those are the OG Bitcoin, huh?
Exactly. And those early forms of currency were the precursors to coinage and credit that developed later on in more advanced civilizations. It's mind-blowing to think that when we use our credit cards today, we're engaging in a system that evolved from those early traders and their creative solutions for exchanging goods.
Whoa, that's heavy. It makes you realize how connected we are to those who came before us.
It really does, and it highlights the enduring power of human ingenuity to shape the world around us.
But before we delve deeper into the evolution of trade, there's one more concept I want to touch upon. Durant explores this idea of primitive communism. What did that actually look like in practice?
It's a concept that often gets debated, but it's important to understand it within its historical context. Many early societies, especially hunter-gatherer groups, had a very strong sense of communal ownership of land and resources.
So, like, everything belonged to everyone.
In a sense, yes. Food was often shared freely, travelers were welcomed and fed, and poverty, as we understand it today, was practically unheard of.
Wow, that sounds like a completely different world.
It does, doesn't it? Imagine a society where everyone contributes to the well-being of the group and resources are distributed based on need.
That's pretty radical. Did this communal living extend to all aspects of their lives?
In many ways, yes. Durant shares this anecdote about a Samoan who was completely baffled when he heard about poverty in London.
Really? Why?
It was a concept so alien to him, so outside his experience of a society where sharing and supporting each other were deeply ingrained.
That's so fascinating. But this communal system must have had its limitations, right? I mean, as societies grew larger and more complex, things had to change.
Absolutely. This system worked well within smaller, close-knit groups. But with the rise of agriculture, things started to shift.
Okay, so not just new food sources, but also a new way of organizing society.
Exactly. And that shift away from primitive communism is a big part of what we'll be exploring next.
I can't wait. But for now, let's just take a moment to reflect on how much we've already covered. It's incredible to think about all that innovation and adaptation that happened even before written history began.
It really is, and it makes you wonder what those early humans would think of our world today.
That's a great question. What do you think stands out as the most significant development we've discussed so far?
To me, it's how those early innovations, things like fire, agriculture, tools, even the concept of trade, laid the foundation for everything that came after. They were the building blocks of civilization, the stepping stones that led us from small nomadic bands to these large, complex societies we live in today.
That's a beautiful way to put it, and it really highlights that long arc of history and how connected we are to those who came before us.
Absolutely, and I think what might surprise people the most is how much we can still learn from those early societies.
How so?
They weren't just simple or backward, as some might assume. They were incredibly innovative, resourceful, and in many ways, they lived in a much closer relationship with nature than we do now.
So their story is not just about the past, it's also about understanding ourselves and our place in the world today.
Exactly. It's a reminder that progress isn't always linear, and that sometimes looking back can help us understand the present and maybe even shape the future.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's a good place to pause for now.
Agreed. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to explore.
Exactly. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive so far. We'll be back soon to continue our journey into the origins of civilization. Until then, keep those fires burning.
And keep asking questions. It's kind of wild, right? How just settling down, like literally planting roots, changed everything for those early societies.
You're totally right. It flipped the script on that whole primitive communism thing we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Suddenly, land ownership became like the key ingredient in how they structured themselves.
Yeah, it was a major power shift. And with that shift came something that's, well, pretty tough to talk about today. Slavery.
Yeah, it was a dark chapter for sure.
To say the least.
Yeah.
But it was a huge driving force during that time, economically speaking.
It's hard to wrap our heads around it now, that it was so widespread and seemingly accepted back then.
Yeah, looking back through our modern lens, it's definitely jarring. But we have to remember the historical context. Back in those early hunter-gatherer days, the idea of slavery wouldn't have even made sense. Everyone had to pitch in for survival, right? It was all about the family unit working together.
So what changed when agriculture took over? Why did slavery suddenly become a thing?
It's all about labor. As agriculture developed, there was this growing need for like a reliable workforce, lots of people to get the job done.
And they found that workforce in the people they captured during conflicts.
Sadly, yeah. It's a brutal reality. Those prisoners of war became a source of free labor to fuel their agricultural expansion.
So they built their civilizations on the backs of forced labor.
It's a grim picture, but that's how it went down. And it was a turning point, a major one in the development of large-scale agriculture and, I guess you could say, civilization itself.
It's heavy stuff to think about. And what's even weirder is Durant suggests that this forced labor situation might have actually, inadvertently laid the foundation for how we think about work today, this whole work ethic thing.
Whoa, that's a mind bender. So you're saying for centuries, work was something forced upon people. And maybe that's why even now we see it as a virtue. Something to be valued, rewarded.
This is a fascinating idea, isn't it?
Definitely food for thought. But as things progressed, it wasn't just about who was enslaved and who wasn't. The lines between the haves and have-nots became more, well, let's just say solidified, right? Wow. Creating this whole social hierarchy.
Oh, absolutely. And Durant makes that point really clear. Moving from that nomadic life, the hunter-gatherer thing, to settled agriculture, it brought stability, but it also planted the seeds for social inequality.
It's like a trade-off, right? Progress in one area, challenges in another.
It's a pattern we see repeated throughout history. And Durant emphasizes the role inheritance played in kind of cementing those divisions.
Ah, yeah. Passing down land, possessions from generation to generation. It created this built-in advantage for certain families, perpetuating cycles of wealth and power.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's a theme that's still playing out in our world today.
Big time. Makes you think about the whole American dream concept. Is it really about equal opportunity, or are some folks just born with a leg up?
That's a question for the ages. But let's shift gears for a bit. We've talked about agriculture and social structures. What about tools? I mean, we touched on those agricultural tools, but what about other aspects of life? How did early humans approach, crafting tools for hunting, building, all the everyday stuff?
This is where their ingenuity shines through, I think. They were masters at looking around them, observing their surroundings, and figuring out how to use those natural materials to meet their needs.
So, true survivalists.
Exactly. For hunting, you had spears, bows and arrows, even fishing nets. Each one meticulously crafted for a specific purpose, for the prey they were targeting, the environment they were in.
And to think, they did all that with such limited resources. It's pretty remarkable when you stop and consider it.
It really is. They had this deep understanding of the natural world. They knew which types of wood would bend but not break, how to make stones sharp and durable, even using animal bones and sinew to, bind things together.
Wow, they were like the original MacGyvers.
Totally. It's easy to look back and think of their achievements as simple or, primitive, But when you consider the challenges they faced, the limited resources they had to work with, their ingenuity becomes even more impressive.
And that resourcefulness wasn't limited to just hunting and gathering, right? They also built shelters, made pottery, created clothing, all sorts of things.
Oh, yeah. The way they could transform those raw materials into functional and sometimes even beautiful objects is amazing. The intricate weaving patterns they used for textiles, or the skill it took to shape and fire clay into pottery, it's mind-blowing.
It makes you question our modern definition of advanced technology, right?
Mm.
Their innovations weren't digital or electronic, but they were game changers for their time.
Right. And it's important to remember that their innovations weren't just about practicality. There was a creative spark there, too, a sense of artistry.
So it wasn't just survival. It was about expressing themselves, making their world a little more beautiful.
Totally. The things they created were an extension of them, you know?
Yeah.
Their connection to nature, their understanding of the world, their desire to create something both useful and, well, beautiful.
It's a reminder that that creative impulse, that drive to make things, it's deeply rooted in our history.
It's in our DNA, and
Oh,
it's
yeah.
that same impulse that keeps us moving forward today, exploring new possibilities, pushing boundaries.
So we've talked about a lot, from fire and agriculture to tools and social structures. What's the big takeaway here? What do you think will stick with people after this deep dive?
I think the most important thing to remember is that these early societies, you know, the ones we often label as simple or primitive, they were anything but. They were complex, innovative, and they achieved some incredible things. And those accomplishments, born out of necessity, driven by their resourcefulness, they laid the foundation for everything that came after, for the world we live in now.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it makes you appreciate just how far we've come and how much we owe to those who came before us.
It really does. And as we keep going with Durant's work, I'm sure we'll find even more surprises, more thought-provoking insights into how civilization began. I, for one, am ready for the next chapter.
Me too. But before we move on, let's leave our listeners with something to chew on. If you could time travel back to one of these early civilizations, what would you be most curious to experience? What skills would you want to master? What challenges would you be eager to face? It's something to think about as we continue our journey.
You know, it's amazing how, even though we're talking about, like, ancient history, so much of what we've discussed feels, I don't know, kind of relevant to our lives today.
I know what you mean. It's like history is this giant mirror reflecting back those patterns of human behavior that
Yes.
keep repeating themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing that really struck me in Durant's writing was this idea of trade being the great disturber of the primitive world.
The great disturber, huh? That's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah.
What did he mean by that?
Well, before trade became widespread, those early societies were pretty isolated. You know, they had to rely on what was immediately around them for pretty much everything.
So a very localized existence? Exactly. But then trade comes along, and suddenly they're exposed to all these new ideas, technologies, even desires that they never even knew existed. It's like, boom, the world just got a whole lot bigger.
And more complicated, I imagine.
Definitely. It was like opening Pandora's box. It disrupted the existing social order, challenged their beliefs, sometimes even led to conflict.
That makes sense. Imagine living in a world where everything you know comes from your immediate surroundings, and then suddenly you're introduced to a whole new way of life.
Right. It's like mind-blowing. And Durant uses that example of, remember, the Dayak trader wandering through the bazaar with his ball of beeswax. He's looking for someone who will trade him something he values more. It really captures that human desire to improve our situation, to always be striving for something better.
It's that restless spirit that drives so much of human progress, isn't it?
Totally. But, as we've seen, progress often comes with a price. Like, who could have predicted that the invention of money, something that was supposed to make trade easier, would lead to such, I don't know, complex economic systems? And let's face it, a lot of inequality.
It's the classic double-edged sword of human ingenuity, right?
Right.
We create tools to solve problems, and then those tools create new problems that we have to solve.
It's a never-ending cycle. But I guess that's what keeps things interesting.
For sure. And it's what makes history so fascinating.
Yeah.
There are always more connections to discover, more insights to uncover.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the economic foundations of civilization, what's the big takeaway here? What do we want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the key takeaway is that civilization, in all its complexity and sometimes contradictions, is ultimately built upon this foundation of economic activity.
So you're saying that from those early hunter-gatherers to our modern interconnected world, It's all about how we produce, exchange, and consume stuff.
Exactly. It's shaped our societies, our cultures, even our individual lives.
It's a reminder that economics isn't just about numbers and markets, it's about how we relate to each other and the world around us.
Well said. It's about understanding those fundamental human interactions that drive everything.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, a huge thank you to you, our expert, for guiding us through this incredible journey. It's been, well, mind-blowing, to say the least.
The pleasure was all mine. And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you enjoyed exploring the roots of civilization with us, and maybe even learned a thing or two along the way.
And hey, as you go about your day today, take a moment to think about all the people who came before you, all the ingenuity and innovation that went into creating the things you use, the food you eat, the systems that, well, that make your life possible.
Yeah, keep those questions coming, stay curious, and keep exploring this fascinating world we live in.
Until next time, happy diving, everyone.
Happy diving!